The worst time to feel alone is when you're in a crowd. Alex Ryder was walking across the playground, surrounded by hundreds of boys and girls of about his own age. They were all heading in the same direction, all wearing the same blue and grey uniform, all of them probably thinking much the same thoughts. The last lesson of the day had just ended. Homework, tea, and television would fill the remaining hours until bed. Another school day. So why did he feel so out of it? As if he were watching the last weeks of the term from the other side of a giant glass screen. Alex jerked his backpack over one shoulder and continued towards the bike shed. The bag was heavy. As usual, it contained double homework, French and history. He had missed 2 weeks of school, and he was having to work hard to catch up. His teachers had not been sympathetic. Nobody had said as much, but when he had finally returned with a doctor's letter, a bad dose of flu with complications, they had nodded and smiled and secretly thought him a little bit pampered and spoiled. On the other hand, they had to make allowances. They all knew that Alex had no parents, that he had been living with an uncle who had died in some sort of car accident. But even so, 2 weeks in bed? Even his closest friends had to admit that that was a bit much. And he couldn't tell them the truth. He wasn't allowed to tell anyone what had really happened. That was the hell of it. Alex looked around him at the children streaming through the school gates, some dribbling footballs, some on their mobile phones. He looked at the teachers, curling themselves into their second-hand cars. At first, he had thought that the whole school had somehow changed while he was away. But he knew now that what had happened was worse. Everything was the same. It was he who had changed. Alex was 14 years old, an ordinary schoolboy in an ordinary West London comprehensive. Or he had been. Only a few weeks ago, he had discovered that his uncle had been a secret agent working for MI6. The uncle, Ian Ryder, had been murdered, and MI6 had forced Alex to take his place. They had given him a crash course in SAS survival techniques and sent him on a lunatic mission on the south coast. He had been chased, shot at, and almost killed. And at the end of it, he had been packed off and sent back to school as if nothing had happened. But first they had made him sign the Official Secrets Act. Alex smiled at the memory of it. He didn't need to sign anything. Who would have believed him anyway? But it was the secrecy that was getting to him now. Whenever anyone asked him what he had been doing in the weeks he'd been away, he'd been forced to tell them that he'd been in bed, reading, slouching round the house, whatever. Alex didn't want to boast about what he'd done, but he hated having to deceive his friends. It made him angry. MI6 hadn't just put him in danger, they'd locked his whole life in a filing cabinet and thrown away the key. He had reached the bike shed. Somebody muttered a goodbye in his direction and he nodded, then reached up to brush away the single strand of fair hair that had fallen over his eye. Sometimes he wished that the whole business with MI6 had never happened. But at the same time, he had to admit it, part of him wanted it all to happen again. Sometimes he felt that he no longer belonged in the safe, comfortable world of Brooklyn school. Too much had changed, and at the end of the day, anything was better than double homework. He lifted his bike out of the shed, unlocked it, pulled the backpack over both his shoulders, and prepared to ride away. That was when he saw the beat-up white car, back again outside the school gates, for the second time that week. Everyone knew about the man in the white car. He was in his 20s, bald, and had 2 broken stumps where his front teeth should have been, and 5 metal studs in his ear. He didn't advertise his name. When people talked about him, they called him Skoda, after the make of his car. But there were some who said that his name was Jake, and he had once been at Brooklyn. If so, he had come back like an unwelcomed ghost. Here 1 minute, vanishing the next. Somehow always a few seconds ahead of any passing police car or over-inquisitive teacher. Skoda sold drugs. He sold soft drugs to the younger kids, and harder stuff to any of the sick formers stupid enough to buy it. It seemed incredible to Alex that Skoda could get away with it so easily, dealing his little packets in broad daylight. But of course there was a code of honour in the school. No one turned anyone into the police, not even a rat like Skoda. And then there was always the fear that if Skoda went down, some of the people he supplied, friends, classmates, might go with him. Drugs had never been a huge problem at Brookland, but recently that had begun to change. A clutch of 17-year-olds had started buying Skoda's goods, and like a stone dropped into a pool, the ripples had rapidly spread. There had been a spate of thefts, as well as 1 or 2 bullying incidents, younger children being forced to bring in money for older kids. The stuff Skoda was selling seemed to get more expensive the more you bought of it, and it hadn't been cheap at the start. Alex watched as a heavy-shouldered boy with dark hair and serious acne lumbered over to the car, paused by the window, then continued on his way. He felt a sudden jolt of anger. The boy's name was Colin, and just 12 months ago he had been one of Alex's best friends. In fact, Colin had been popular with everyone. But then, everything had changed. He had become moody and withdrawn. His work had gone downhill. Suddenly, nobody had wanted to know him, and this was the reason. Alex had never thought much about drugs, apart from knowing that he would never take them himself. But he could see that the man in the white car wasn't just poisoning a handful of dumb kids. He was poisoning the whole school. A policeman on foot patrol appeared, walking towards the gate. A moment later, the white car was gone, black smut bubbling from a faulty exhaust. Alex was on his bike before he knew what he was doing, pedalling fast out of the playground, swerving round the school secretary who was also on her way home. "Not too fast, Alex!" she called out, and sighed when he ignored her. Miss Bedfordshire had always had a soft spot for Alex without knowing quite why, and she alone in the school had wondered if there hadn't been more to his absence than the doctor's note had suggested. The white Skoda accelerated down the road, turning left, then right, and Alex thought he was going to lose it. But then it twisted through the maze of back streets that led up to the King's Road and hit the inevitable 4 o'clock traffic jam, coming to a halt about 200 metres ahead. The average speed of traffic in London is, at the start of the 21st century, lower than it used to be in Victorian times. During normal working hours, any bicycle will beat any car on just about any journey at all. And Alex wasn't riding just any bike. He still had his Condor Junior Road Racer, hand-built for him in the workshop that had been open for business in the same street in Holborn for more than 50 years. He'd recently had it upgraded, with an integrated brake and gear lever system fitted to the handlebar, and he only had to flick his thumb to feel the bike click up a gear, the lightweight titanium sprocket spinning smoothly beneath him. He caught up with the car just as it turned the corner, and joined the rest of the traffic on the King's Road. He would just have to hope that Skoda was going to stay in the city, but somehow Alex didn't think it likely that he would travel too far. The drug dealer hadn't chosen Brookland School as a target simply because he'd been there. It had to be somewhere in his general neighbourhood, not too close to home, but not too far either. The lights changed, and the white car jerked forward, heading west. Alex was pedalling slowly, keeping a few cars behind, just in case Skoda happened to glance in his mirror. They reached the corner known as World's End, and suddenly the road was clear, and Alex had to switch gears again and pedal hard to keep up. The car drove on, through Parsons Green and down towards Putney. Alex twisted from one lane to another, cutting in front of a taxi and receiving the blast of a horn as his reward. It was a warm day, and he could feel his French and history homework dragging down his back. How much further were they going? And what would he do when they got there? Alex was beginning to wonder if this had been a good idea when the car turned off, and he realised they had arrived. Skoda had pulled up into a rough tarmac area, a temporary car park next to the River Thames not far from Putney Bridge. Alex stayed on the bridge, allowing the traffic to roll past, and watched as the drug dealer got out of his car and began to walk. The area was being redeveloped, another block of prestige flats rising up to bruise the London skyline. Right now, the building was no more than an ugly skeleton of steel girders and prefabricated concrete slabs. It was surrounded by a swarm of men in hard hats. There were bulldozers, cement mixers, and towering above them all, a huge canary yellow crane. A sign read, "Riverview House, All visitors report to the site office. Alex wondered if Skoda had some sort of business on the site. He seemed to be heading for the entrance. But then he turned off. Alex watched him, puzzled. The building site was wedged in between the bridge and a cluster of modern buildings. There was a pub, then what looked like a brand new conference centre, and finally, a police station, with a car park half filled with official cars. But right next to the building site, sticking out into the river, was a wooden jetty, with 2 cabin cruisers and an old iron barge quietly rusting in the murky water. Alex hadn't noticed the jetty at first, but Skoda walked straight onto it, then climbed onto the barge. He opened a door and disappeared inside. Was this where he lived? It was late in the day. Somehow Alex doubted he was about to set off on a pleasure cruise down the River Thames. He got back on his bike and cycled slowly to the end of the bridge, and then down towards the car park. He left the bike and his backpack out of sight and continued on foot, moving more slowly as he approached the jetty. He wasn't afraid of being caught. This was a public place, and even if Skoda did reappear, there would be nothing he could do. But he was curious. Just what was the drug dealer doing on board a barge? It seemed a bizarre place to have stopped. Alex still wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he wanted to have a look inside. Then he would decide. The wooden jetty creaked under his feet as he stepped onto it. The barge was called Blue Shadow, but there was little blue left in the flaking paint, the rusty ironwork and the dirty oil-covered decks. The barge was about 10 meters long and very square, with a single cabin in the center. It was lying low in the water, and Alex guessed that most of the living quarters would be underneath. He knelt down on the jetty and pretended to tie his shoelaces, hoping to look through the narrow slanting windows. But all the curtains were drawn. What now? The barge was moored on one side of the jetty. The 2 cruisers were side by side on the other. Skoda wanted privacy, but he must also need light, and there would be no need to draw the curtains on the far side with nothing there apart from the river. The only trouble was, to look in the other windows, Alex would have to climb onto the barge itself. He considered briefly. It had to be worth the risk. He was near enough to the building site, nobody was going to try and hurt him with so many people around. He placed 1 foot on the deck, then slowly transferred his weight onto it. He was afraid that moving the barge would give him away. Sure enough, the barge dipped under his weight, but Alex had chosen his moment well. A police launch was sailing past, heading up the river and back into town. The barge bobbed naturally in its wake, and by the time it settled, Alex was on board, crouching next to the cabin door.